Hello everybody and welcome to this final webinar from Azure at the end of what has been a torrid year, I think, for all of us in 2020. And so we're very happy to be ending our series for the autumn-winter of 2020 on seeking the soul of business, a subject which isn't a usual everyday subject, but one that we hope will bring some points of reflection perhaps and some inquiry into how we build our businesses going forward, and particularly at this time when, of course, so much change is happening. There's plenty to get our teeth stuck into in terms of possible change. So you're all very, very welcome, and we are going to keep the cameras off during the session, but I will be inviting times for reflection and sharing and comments, so do feel free to join in, and at that point obviously take yourself off mute and comment. The other thing I'd invite you to do is use the chat, and by all means put comments, questions, whatever you would like to in the chat, and I will do my best to keep an eye on that, bring those comments in and answer, well, not that I'm the oracle, but answer any questions or get involved in the debate that you might be raising. So I've got a couple of ways to be involved in this session today. So let's move into our session then, and I know pretty much everybody on the session here today, but just to introduce myself, I'm Lorraine Flower, and I am a part of the leadership and organizational development consultancy called Azure. We position ourselves very much as a conscious leadership and organizational development consultancy, and the reason we do that is because we're dedicated to helping individuals and organizations as a collective find ways in which they can have greater awareness about the actions that they're taking and the way in which they are engaging with their organization and with the wider world. Some of that's very subtle and some of it's very direct, but that's what we work with, and that's so again, if I could just invite you to turn your cameras off, that would be great, so that we can see the slides fully, and that doesn't then interfere with the recording. So Jackie, could I just ask you to turn your camera? Thank you, brilliant. Okay, so enough of me, and let's move into our subject for today. And I think there's a couple of things I just want to get out of the way before we get too far into our subject. And that is that although we're going to spend a lot of time exploring and opening up the subject of soulfulness and what does that look like in an organizational space, I think it's just important to say a couple of things up front, because it might sound as though we don't believe these things, and that's not the case. I mean, I just want to say that making a profit is okay. I mean, it's more than okay, it's fundamental, it's necessary. We know when we're balancing our own home budgets that there has to be enough coming in order to cover the expenses and the aspirations and desires that we have, and the things that we want to be able to do in the world, not least of which obviously is feed and house ourselves. But from a business point of view, of course, we have to be able to cover all our costs and have enough money to be able to continue to invest in the business in a way that meets the overall goals and aims of that business. So making a profit is okay, but that will qualify that a bit as we go further in. Of course, it's important to be practical and focus on the tasks. We have to get things done. But as we go further into seeking an understanding of the soul and its relevance to business, it can feel a little abstract. It can feel a little as though we're not kind of operating in that space of practicality. And that's not the case. Of course, we have to translate whatever inspiration is coming through, whatever sense we have of what this thing is that we call soul. It has to come into manifest form. It has to become practical. And therefore, that's, of course, something that we organize our businesses to be able to do. As you'll have heard us say on other webinars, the challenge that businesses face, organizations face in general, is that so often that becomes the sole driving force. We get completely taken up in pursuing the tasks, and we perhaps lose our line of sight back to some of the reasons why we're doing what we're doing. So it's, as I say, it's not that we are not supportive of the need for practical application, but today we're going to be exploring some of that, the other side that perhaps doesn't get so much airtime. And of course, linked to that, focusing on the systems and processes that enable our organizations to work is also okay. All of those things are fundamentals in the way in which organizations work successfully. And I'd go further and say that in many respects, it's one of the key areas, all of those things, our ability to make things happen in the world of organizations and businesses is in itself a very powerful contribution to being able to co-create and come to a place where we can manifest things that are useful both to humanity and the planet. So in that sense, it's got a much higher purpose to it, and organizations have spent decades, millennia, fine-tuning and honing the capability to make things happen in an efficient way. As I said, the challenge here, though, is that that can go too far, and we end up with an unbalanced perspective. And so today we're looking at how we might rebalance that. We've titled this Seeking the Soul of Business, and if any of you have done any work in this area or tried to do any reading in this area, you'll know there's relatively little out there to get hold of. A lot of what is out there is in the more religious, spiritual space, and we'll touch into that today. But I've tried to bring some insights and thoughts in that are hopefully a little bit accessible on a general level. So quotes are always helpful because they give us a sense of the terrain, of the territory that we're working in and that we're thinking about. And so I've picked these out as examples of things that perhaps might start to give us some sense of, first of all, what we even mean by soul. A word we might use perhaps less frequently, but nevertheless, it's not an uncommon word. And we all will have a sense of it. We'll have a sense of what it means to be soulful. We apply it to music, don't we? Soulful music. And so we have some appreciation of it. But these quotes perhaps help us to get another aspect or other aspects of our own understanding. This one by C.S. Lewis is an interesting one. It's one that certainly in the kind of spiritual communities would be endorsed loudly, and that's this idea that it's not about having a soul, it's about being a soul, and that we have a body. I'll come on and say a bit more about that in a while. So that first kind of question really is really, can we identify with ourselves as a soul rather than just through the physical realm, through the physical body? Bob Marley's quote, again, as you see, these are people who are in themselves expressing aspects of soul, but are very much connected to the everyday practical world. He's bringing forward this idea of wisdom versus material gain, and that we can think about the soul as almost a repository of wisdom, a source of wisdom, a library, if you will, of wisdom, a place where we can access something greater. And if we are connected with our soul, if we have that sense of soul, we can perhaps get another level of resource. But also, he's raising here that question of, do we trade our soul for material gain, for physical matters? So again, we need to be careful about what is the guiding principle, and are we connected to that? Do we have a sense of those guiding principles from our soul? These all apply, of course, to business as well. Rumi, who is a philosopher and a very deep and powerful thinker, brings us to the idea that the soul gets us to a place that we can't access just through the concrete mind. So as human beings, we do a lot of thinking. We pride ourselves on thinking. We prize intellect. We like the fact that people are able to develop ideas through thinking. But actually, if we are accessing the soul, if we're in relationship with our soul, we actually access a whole other level of, as I said, wisdom or insight or intuition. We have a different connection, and the soul is able to operate in a space that goes beyond perhaps the concrete mind and what we can see and feel and know on an everyday basis. And we will all have had those moments where we feel inspired, or that inflow of spirit, which is where inspire comes from. And that's where it comes to something beyond the logical or the concrete or the rational. And then Marianne Williamson, also an educator and spiritual philosopher and writer, brings us to another expression of soul, the truth of who we are. Truth is a big word, and truth is a word that many people will try to force on us, their truth, their way of seeing the world. But again, if we're in contact with our soul, we have a sense of a truth, a knowing, an understanding that is bigger and deeper than any that might be imposed on us by any authority, whether that's religion, whether that's an organization, or whether it's our parents or any other external force. When we come to a knowing of truth, then we get to a sense of a real relationship with our soul, but also with something greater than that. So these quotes start to open up something that is perhaps a bit more abstract, but also hopefully still relatable. Always useful to go to the dictionary when we're looking for explanations and understandings. And here are some definitions that come from doing that, from going into the world where people have crystallized, brought together, synthesized some of the understandings that we have around soul. And again, some interesting phrases or notions coming through here. The first one brings us into contact with 4 keywords here: consciousness, thought, feeling, and will. We'll develop these a little bit further as well as we go in. Consciousness we speak about quite a lot in these webinars, so I'm not going to go into that in depth here today, but that is that sense of awareness, that how high, how far, how broad, how deep does our awareness go? How much beyond our own individual self-interest or self-awareness, self-consideration can we go, and can we expand that out, and how far can we expand? So consciousness is that expansive feel. Thought, of course, is both the concrete level, but it's also inspiration. It's also thought that comes from beyond that concrete mind. Feeling, that's that sensing ability, and will, a sense of drive, a sense of commitment, a sense of focus. So will is an interesting one, and again, may well be a subject we do some more work on in one of our future webinars, because it's a very powerful area to consider. What we also see from these definitions, things like the emotional and moral nature, which is, how does that soul get expressed? How does soul get expressed in the world? How do we show up in the world? Truth, again, deep and truest nature of our people, of a people or nation. So getting to that essence of somebody, and that which gives somebody or something distinctive character, uniqueness, something again, je ne sais quoi, and a feeling, a knowing. We know it when we experience it, when we see it, but it's something distinctive. And again, we need to be thinking about, how do these apply in the business world and the organizational world? So let's try and bring a few of those things together. Forgive me if this feels a little bit kind of almost academic, but it's not intended to be. Here, what we're trying to bring forward is a sense of understanding of how we relate the soul to what we know as the personality or our everyday sense. And we see this again with organizations as well. When you think about the brand of an organization or the culture of an organization or the things it does or says, we might describe some of that as its personality, and we might describe some of that as its soul. And so it's worth getting a little bit of sense of the two of those. And anything I put up here would not be exhaustive. So when we open up for some discussion, I'm sure others will have other perspectives on this. But from the soul point of view, we might describe that as having a number of different aspects. Love, of course. Beauty, definitely. Justice, that sense of what is right, what is fair, what is inclusive, that sense, justice in the sense of considering all. Truth, we've mentioned. Service, being in service of others, being in service of something beyond ourselves. So the soul takes us into that higher domain, some of which we've described as consciousness before as well. We might describe the personality in much more concrete terms, in terms of, if we're looking at it in business, spreadsheets, economics, capabilities, knowledge, gifts, talent, skills, systems, processes, those sorts of things. So how do we do things? How do we manifest into the world? You'll see a yellow line going through between the soul and the personality. And in an individual, what we hope as we evolve is that we start to feel a greater sense of connection between how we show up in the world and those higher qualities, those higher aspects that we might describe as soul. And over time, the more we seek to be in relationship with our soul, the more we come to a place where we influence the way we show up in the world through the lens of the soul. And we get what in the middle here is called the soul-infused personality, to one degree or another. So it's about trying to think of how we bring the soul and the personality into some sort of relationship with each other. And we might describe that as a level of integration between the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual aspects of ourselves. Now, the other danger of a subject like this is that we can start to think about it as, we all have to be perfect, and anybody who is soulful is perfect. I think it's important to dispel that. We know, and we'll again talk about some characters in a second, but it's very, it's a long journey to become fully soul infused, and at which point we maybe don't even belong on the earth when that happens. So it's that long journey of trying to improve our relationship between those higher values and then how we show up in the world at its most basic level. And of course, we're all human, and so things happen, we do things that when we look back on them, we think, well, no, that wasn't particularly soul inspired, but we learn from it, and by learning, we gain more of that wisdom that I was talking about earlier. Just a couple of other things before we get into a little bit of conversation. I spoke from both the dictionary definition and some of the quotes that we had about this idea of essence. And there's also the sense of a mysterious quality here as well. As we get more into the soul, there's something becomes a little harder to actually put labels on things, to hold it, and we try, and obviously we all have language to do that, but it is something quite mysterious and often unspoken. And here's just a couple of ways in which we might kind of try to grasp that when we think about people and we compare and contrast different people in our lives. We can go beyond some of the outer form and perhaps get a sense of their quintessential nature. Who are they? When you really strip everything away. Now that's quite a deep space, and we don't all reveal the truth of who we are for all sorts of reasons, which we won't go into right now. But that sense of their essence, what is that? And how do we experience it and connect with it? in terms of ideas, the essence of an idea. And if you try to take that away from something, that you destroy the whole concept. So finding that fundamental essence, and academics obviously work a lot in this space, or the artist. When we see artistic works and we connect with something that is so radiant, so different, so has so much mystery and essence to it, again, we sometimes struggle to find the words for it. So another way of experiencing or connecting with that sense of soulfulness. And again, bringing qualities in at another level. We could talk about those qualities as we take them from that sort of very purest expression at the soul level I outlined earlier. We might see that in things like empathy, honesty, humility, the way in which we inspire people, the way in which we're willing to show our vulnerability. All of these can start to bring us into the space of understanding and experiencing aspects of soul manifest in the everyday world. And if we bring all of that together, we might summarize this in this way, that actually the soul is an expression of love and will. Love, the softer qualities, although sometimes very, very hard in terms of, you know, the need for some tough love and compassion, very hard to do quite often, but expressing love, but also the strength of the will, the ability to direct a force and create outcomes, make things happen. So the soul is not just living in some soft, fluffy cotton wool land. It wants to manifest, it wants to bring things into fruition. But two principles that really guide the soul, and this becomes relevant when we start to think about this in its application to business, are a deep commitment to oneness, to allness, to wholeness, that sense that everything is connected. And we've talked about that when we've looked at consciousness in the past. And also this commitment, this sense of operating for the greater good, human, animal, planetary, every level, committed to the greater good. So when we're in resonance with our soul, both in business terms and in individual terms, these will be some of the things that will be showing up for us. I said we'd come back to some people, and maybe this just will be an opportunity to open up the sharing if anybody has anything they want to comment on at this point about anything that I've said. But you know, when we think about this in terms of people, which is often a useful way to bring ourselves into some sort of sense of soul and soulfulness through the human entity. We could put any number of names up here. I've picked a few: Michelangelo, Galileo, William Wilberforce, Mandela, Churchill. All we would perhaps associate with some level of greatness. And I think it would be fair to say that the soul was somewhat integrated in these people. They were able to be in contact with their soul, or allow their soul to express itself, so get out of the way of the soul sufficiently for inspiration to come through them and for greatness to be expressed through them. Were they all perfect human beings? Did they all have the most benevolent personalities? For sure not. We know that. We know that Mandela was, you know, very much a fiery activist in his youth, and you know, doing things that wouldn't necessarily be considered, quote, good, in pursuit of his purpose and his beliefs. And similarly, Churchill, we know, was a very unreconstructed leader throughout much of his political career and life. And yet, when the time was right and he was needed to step into that space of the soul, he was able to do that, albeit with his personality imperfections. So I'm going to stop for a moment and just see if there's anything anybody wants to contribute to where we've got to so far. We're going to go into more business focus in our second part, but just having laid the ground of some thinking around soul, anything that anybody wants to either reinforce or dispute. Thanks, Helen. Yes, interesting that the soulful individuals here are all men. Wow, yes, there you go. Now that's one for me to go away and think about because, yeah, why didn't I pick any women? Because they definitely are there. Mother Teresa would be one. Um, so I'm just thinking of others. In some ways, we might almost say Margaret Thatcher, but I know that would divide the crowd. But she's someone I saw a lot of will coming through in my formative years. Okay, Michelle, thank you. Florence Nightingale, Emily Pankhurst, of course, a great example. And we called this Seeking the Soul in Business because it's can sometimes be hard to find, in the sense that it's not a subject that people talk about openly. It's not a subject that we tend to express, and yet we've all been part of organizations, either led them, well, in many cases led them, in many cases been part of various ventures, and we will all be able to relate to times when we've had an experience of something great, greater, powerful, something where there was a level of resonance that was coming together, perhaps in the whole organization, perhaps in part of it, and perhaps at certain times in the organization's life. So whilst we may not have given it the language of soul, we will have had some connection, some sense of something powerful going on, and a congruence in both the inner and outer expression of that organization's life. But in kind of going on the search for the soul, I thought a good place to start would be in startups. And anybody who's been lucky enough to be in a startup or part of a startup, I say lucky, that's not because they're all wonderful places, because they're not, but very typically in startups, what we discover relatively quickly and relatively easily is a high degree of energy. There's something that comes through, often through the founder, because in any startup, even where there are multiple people involved in a startup, there's going to be someone who's had the spark of the idea. It's come through an individual, typically speaking, and then they form people around them. Interestingly, quite often in a startup, for it to get beyond something small and into something bigger, it typically needs 3 people. We typically see that it takes a triangle to get into something where the mobilization of a startup really happens. But anyway, energetically, what we see in startups? Well, typically we see a lot of energy, a lot of focusing on what is essential, what is needed, but also a sense of something intangible, something that we can't quite get our hands on, or something we might call presence. And that sort of manifests in the way in which people connect with each other, the way in which they relate to each other, and also their sense of mutual purpose, kind of all in it together. There's a little bit of that sort of Three Musketeers spirit that comes through, where there's a sense of people don't get too caught up in the delineation of roles or functions or rules, or it has to be done, but they just get on with stuff. They just get on with stuff, and they meet the opportunities and the trials and tribulations as they come at them, and they band together to resolve those. Now, I'm not saying every startup is smooth and without, its tensions. Of course, there are tensions, but there is a kind of energy force that is present in startups, and typically that would be the inspiration, that sense of why we're doing stuff. And we've spoken at length about the work of Simon Sinek, bringing us into close relationship with that question of why. Why do we do things? What is our underpinning passion and focus? And that's very present in a startup. And there are a number of organizations, certainly one that we work with at the moment, where the first 7 years or so of their life as a startup, they all look back on fondly. Those who are now getting on for 20 years in the business look back on those days as some sort of halcyon period, because of the quality of the relationships, the quality of the communication, the quality of the working together that took place in those early startup days. And this quote from Howard Schultz from Starbucks, and again, this may divide the crowd a little bit in terms of, you know, are Starbucks an exemplar or not? But this, I think this quote is quite interesting, and I think there's a lot of soulfulness in it, which pulls out the fact that this organization is at its best when there is collaboration going on that provides an oasis, an uplifting feeling of comfort and connection, as well as a deep respect for the coffee and communities we serve. And within that, we start to see, obviously, the essential purpose, the why Starbucks was created in the first place, even if that isn't what we experience every day when we go into a Starbucks. Not that we're doing that so often these days. But it is something about that kind of foundational cornerstone of an organization. And that becomes very present and is very present in startups. And it's an energy that fuels through thick and thin. And also, as I put here in this quote from Sebastian Junger and from his book, Tribe, there's something here also about the way in which employees really identify with these enterprises. And there's an unquestioning sense of loyalty and belonging, and that's feeding this quest for meaning. And meaning is a really important part when we start to think about soul in the context of organizations and life, but in thinking about it now in the organizational space, thinking about that sense of meaning, that sense of real deep connection with a core purpose and a sense of something more than just the everyday transaction. So I'm curious again now, just to open it up a little bit, when you think about your most recent interactions with businesses, any organizations that you've interacted with, which have felt most soulful and why? What has given you a sense of that soulfulness? And just to kind of prompt us a little bit there, I think often we will notice in small, maybe local cafes, not chains necessarily, or although it might express itself through one of the chains, but local coffee shops, perhaps somebody who's got an individual passion for coffee and cake and feeding the nation something lovely and tasty and heartwarming, maybe through farmers markets or farm shops or things that are local in our community where people have really thought about what they're going to bring forward and why they're bringing it forward, and are staying, still staying quite small in that sense. But what about larger organizations where they've managed to retain that sense of the startup? So I'm curious, who or what have you come into contact with in terms of businesses where you felt there was something soulful happening, and how would you describe that? So what does happen with startups that grow and become larger? And of course, there has been that holy grail of scale, of getting bigger. And there's always a question of what's actually underpinning that drive for growth. But in thinking this through, there seem to be really three key areas that dampen down that spark that we see, as you say, David and Jackie, through the examples you've given. We see it in either pockets or in groups or in certain subsets in larger organizations. One of these comes to that sense of that thread back to purpose and meaning. As we get into organizational life and start growing and so on, that the doing part of running an organization takes over, and we feel for some reason a need to drive for control, drive for operationalizing, we drive for things that are efficiency based and so on and so forth. And of course, as I said up front, we have to pay attention to profit, we have to pay attention to good housekeeping and good budgeting and all of those things. And yet somehow that drive for growth seems to have become a holy grail in its own right, and has distorted and created a level of imbalance. Now, you know, I grew up in my business career in the 80s when globalization was relatively young in its expression, but growing like wildfire, and everybody wanted to be a global business. That was where success lie. The challenge for any organization is if you don't know why you're doing that in a true sense of purpose and meaning, you go for that growth at any cost. Even if you don't intend to go for it at any cost, you go for it at any cost. So even if essentially the business is you know, filled with good people with good intention, that drive for growth is the thing that then drives the bureaucracy and impacts that deep connection with purpose and meaning. And that's not to say that global organizations don't have a value. Of course they do. But the only way they can retain true contribution is if they retain a deep, deep sense of why they're doing what they're doing, and how that purpose and meaning is expressed in every fiber of their setup, in every way that they function. We often quote Unilever as one of the examples here, and Paul Polman specifically, he's not CEO there anymore, but he very famously pushed back with the stock market on the quarterly profits updates and performance to the city, and said, you know, go away. I'm not doing these quarterly updates anymore. We've got a purpose as a business. We've got a direction that we're trying to go. We're committed to sustainability. I'm not going to be assessed by you every 3 months as to whether I'm doing that right or wrong, so that you can judge me on financial measures. You know, and the shareholders all have to live with that. So there's something here about the relationship between the shareholders and the organization as a whole, and the alignment or otherwise between the goals of those entities, the shareholder entity and the organization itself. And there are so many CEOs who would say that they in themselves personally have a deep sense of what we're talking about here in terms of soul, a deep sense of purpose, of meaning, of wanting to do something bigger and better, but that everything that they are about is then measured by financial performance, growth targets, and shareholder return. And because of those drivers, that creates a piece by piece sacrifice of all the things that would be more soulful in an organization. And we talk about it in, we've again put many quotes and stats up around the level of engagement that we see. This is a more recent study done by Towers Watson, where, you know, this is not new data. Only 20% of employees are truly engaged with their work, body and soul. Now, this isn't about exploiting employees and, you know, working them to the bone. This is about people who are truly able to be connected to a place of meaning, to a sense of connection, to a sense of participation in the organization, are going to give more of their creativity, more of their own inspiration, more of their own passion, and more of their own capability. And that enriches the organization, the entity for the whole. So, you know, we know that there's a fundamental problem in the way our organizations are set up, but coming back to the connection with why we're doing what we're doing, and really having the courage to make that the kind of touchstone for our business decisions is key. Yes, Helen, trust or lack of it, often at the root of dissonance and the reduction of the soul impact. So I describe the soul as love, beauty, justice, truth, service. There is a deficit of those things in business. We don't use those sorts of words in relation to business. We're starting to see a little bit more coming through on the justice front, with a heavy emphasis coming through on equality, diversity and inclusion. Most self-respecting organizations are active in that space at the moment. That's an expression of justice. But there are many other areas where that needs to be focused on. And you know, there's almost an argument for having somebody be the conscience of an organization in some ways, and kind of really constantly speaking truth to power in terms of the deficiencies in an organizational setup. I think this quote from Viktor Frankl in Man's Search for Meaning is also useful for us in thinking about success. So we know that any organization, any individual can utilize the economic system as it currently exists, and with, you know, sheer determination and not a care for anything else, can achieve what we describe as financial success. You know, the Wolf of Wall Street, the Golden Geckos in the kind of film sense, those people who just go after money for the sake of money. Of course, you can leverage our system and know how to do that, and we might call that success. But for true success, it has to come as a result of our dedication to something bigger than ourselves, for it to be a real soulful quality of success. And that's something all of our organizations have to come back to. So to David's question, is it possible for a business to grow and retain a connection with its soul? Well, apart from the fact I'm always hopeful and I'm something of an idealist, I'm going to say yes, because otherwise, you know, my whole vocational life is, you know, it goes down the pan. But yes, I believe it is. I believe it is possible for large organizations to retain connection with soul. But it requires courage and it requires will. And we spoke, you know, in defining the soul as love and will. We've got to be able to bring both of those things in the right measure to get back to that place. Put a few examples up here, some of which are favorites of ours and we've used before. To be honest, there's probably barely 20 organizations that we could pick out who I think are reasonable exemplars of this, and not all of them are perfect. Most of you won't have heard of Barry Wehmiller unless you've been on this webinar at previous times. You can see their purpose there, building a better world through business. Bob Chapman is the CEO of this still family owned, there's a clue there, I think, family owned business, private business, a huge, massive, multi-billion-dollar business. The cornerstone that they hold in their business is one of humanness. So love, care, connection. It permeates every single aspect of what they do. It is the thing by which they measure their success as a business. Not financial growth or business growth in that kind of more traditional sense. Southwest Airlines, as you know, I'm an ex-airline girl, so always good to see an airline option. Southwest Airlines have long been held up in the airline industry as an example of an organization that really gets it when it comes to the connection between their employees and the employees' relationship with the business, and the way in which they foster and cultivate those relationships with employees, and how that then translates into the customer experience. They're passionate about both, but they prioritize the employee experience. And there's all sorts of apocryphal stories about the former CEO, Herb Kelleher, receiving a letter from a customer complaining about something that an employee had done, and Kelleher went back and said to the customer, what my member of staff did was absolutely right. I back them, and I'm sorry if you disagree, and if that means we lose you, I'm sorry about that too, but you know, I'm very happy with the action that my member of staff took. Danone, a very powerful example, but interestingly one where there is a challenge between the intention as expressed through the management team and the shareholders. So Danone, as you can see from their strapline there, One Planet, One Health, very committed to sustainability at the core of their purpose statement. They're fundamentally connected to it, seeking to become and on their way to becoming the largest global B Corporation. But at the moment, they're in a conflict. They've come, like all of us, through a torrid COVID in one form or another, and they're getting a lot of pressure on costs and efficiencies and so on through the shareholder route. They are making some redundancies. They are cutting costs wherever they possibly can. But actually, there is now so much pressure coming from the shareholders to protect their profits and investment, that they're talking about the fact that this commitment to the purpose has gone too far. It's gone too far, and they're looking to possibly destabilize, remove the existing management, which would be a shame if that were to happen. So is there a too far? Yeah, possibly. But you've got to keep the practicalities in balance, of course, but you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater when things are destabilizing. And I've put Microsoft there again, one that divides the crowds. So it's a love-hate. But Satya Nadella, who was the CEO who took over from Bill Gates, is known for empathy. And he has built the current Microsoft operation on a fundamental commitment to empathy, being connected to each other, relationship, and being real in those relationships, and he tries to stay in that space. Karen has given us another example. Alison Rose, the CEO of NatWest, is introducing a soulful intention, unlocking potential for all community and environmental concerns. So I think there is an awakening going on, if that's not too spiritual a way of expressing it. I think there is awakening. I remain hopeful. So trying to kind of sum up the answer to the question of, is it possible to grow and retain some relationship with the soul of a business, of an organization, of a startup? I think so far, from the many years of thinking and research that I've done in this space, it comes down to probably these 4 areas. We could describe them in other ways perhaps, but coming back to that, what is the intent behind the business, and how does that then play out in its culture and values? What's the nature and quality of the employee experience? Are we really dedicated to that? Do we really have this sense of empathy, connection, building relationship, enabling people to have a sense of belonging and meaning? Are we bringing in talented people? Are we, and by that I don't just mean in the sense that somebody's got a great gift and that's it, but where that talent is able to live and breathe and be expressed. So perhaps part of the employee experience in that sense, and where that truth of who we are is able to come forward, not just because we've got knowledge and a set of skills, but because of how we show up. And that sense of customer connection, remembering why we're doing what we're doing. And if we've got a true relationship with our customer, we don't come into that cynical space of profit at any cost, because we recognize that what we want to do is leave our customers with a strong, positive emotional feeling, something where there's a real sense of their connection with us as an entity, as an organization. Some of the steps that we might take, well, I think we've touched on most of these, but different research brings forward a number of different ways of expressing it. Really take a look at the degree to which we are balancing relational and transactional work. How much of what is going on in an organization is connecting people deeply to meaning and purpose, and then the transactional stuff, the tasky stuff, becomes a beautiful expression of that. So when we think back to one of those qualities of the soul as beauty, then the transactional, the doing part of it, comes with a grace and a beauty that is effortless in many ways. So if we can keep people in relationship with the meaning and purpose, if we can become more of a learning organization. This is taken from a book written by Rishad Tabakawala. He really emphasizes the need to be constantly learning, constantly opening ourselves to the new, doing something new, challenging our thinking, building a business case that's the opposite of what you believe, because that way it tests your thinking, takes you into that sort of thinking partner space. But a commitment to learning it seems to be really helpful. Really thinking about how can we improve the experience of others. So going beyond self or money or shareholder, although we want to improve their experience too, but improve it in the context of the long term, not just the short term. Have more meetings. That we've talked about this kind of relationship and connection, and meetings are the scourge of most organizations, I know. But actually, if they were real meetings, soulful meetings, where there was true connection and empathy, people would enjoy meetings. They would come to them with more passion, with more creativity, with more energy. So how can we create meetings that are full of empathy and connection? And I've mentioned the word connection many times, but that is a fundamental part of restoring soulfulness. It's restoring that connection to the purpose, connection to each other, connection to the outer world, connection to oneness, really seeing the pathways where connection can be built, and really holding on to that place of integrity, that sense where we don't allow our values and our beliefs and our sense of direction, our balance between love and will, we don't allow that to become sacrificed and distorted, and we really hold ourselves and our organizations to account in that space. And finally, just to wrap us up in the last minute or so, these are a couple of quotes. They come from unexpected sources, but for me they were quite interesting. Ferdinand Foch is a World War I general, not a particularly, wouldn't describe him as a nice man, a very willful man for sure, but did some amazing things in terms of the battles of the First World War. But he expressed this phrase: the most powerful weapon on earth is the human soul on fire. Connecting to the fieriness of our soul. It is alive with fire, but we have to open the pathway to that. And that allows us then to bring that power, that quality through into all that we do, be it the washing up, ticking stuff off our task list, or having some newly inspired insight to the way we want to take our lives and our organizations forward. And then Ray Charles, again, not necessarily a great spiritual philosopher, but thinking about a soul as electricity, a force that can light a room. So when we think about organizations that are soulful, when we think about people who are soulful, we think about that quality, that dynamic, that force that can light a room. That's what we need to stay in connection with, and that's what we have to get cleverer at in bringing into our organizations.